The sun was beginning to hide behind the buildings of Sacramento, spreading orange hues over the city's hot asphalt. Traffic moved slowly on that summer afternoon, with tired drivers heading home and cyclists vying for space among the cars. Eric Porter drove his black sedan calmly, one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gear shift. His face, marked by years of experience and observation, maintained a serene yet ever-alert expression. To an outsider, he appeared to be just another man on his way home from work, but the truth was that Eric carried an invisible weight. As the head of the Internal Affairs Division of the Sacramento Police, he knew that every corner, every approach, every glance could hide stories that would never reach the public. Siren! A police officer was behind him, signaling for him to pull over. Eric furrowed his brow. Not quite sure why, but without hesitation he slowed down and stopped on the shoulder. He adjusted the side mirror and took a deep breath before lowering the window. The officer approached with firm steps, one hand resting on the holster of his gun. His name was embroidered on his uniform, Officer Bradley Larson. With a rigid look, furrowed brow, and a posture that suggested he already had a verdict prepared before even beginning his judgment. Officer Larson leaned slightly into the car, evaluating Eric with a cold and calculating gaze. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over?" His voice was controlled, but it carried an underlying tone of distrust. Eric, remaining calm, replied without hesitation, "I imagine it has something to do with the traffic light." Larson crossed his arms and let out a slight sigh, as if he were already tired of this interaction before it even began. "That's right. You didn't come to a complete stop at the red light before turning right. May I see your driver's license and vehicle registration?" The formality of the approach should have been routine, but something in Larson's tone made it seem that this request was just a pretext for something bigger. Eric knew this dynamic well. He had seen and heard such stories countless times within the department. Without questioning, he took out his wallet and produced the documents, handing them over to the officer with a controlled movement. Larson quickly took them and stepped back a few paces, still scrutinizing Eric with keen eyes. The pause lasted a few seconds longer than necessary, as if the officer were deliberately prolonging the tension. While Larson checked the documents in the system, Eric watched through the side mirror as other cars passed by without being stopped. He wondered how many drivers had done the same at that light and continued without any problem. His thought was interrupted when Larson returned, now with an even sterner expression. "Mr. Porter," he began, emphasizing the name as if savoring each syllable. "The car is registered in your name, no record of recent violations." He paused, as if waiting for a specific reaction. Eric simply nodded, without altering his expression. This seemed to unsettle Larson, who rested his hand on the car window and leaned in closer. "Where were you headed?" The question was not part of the standard protocol for such a simple traffic violation. There was no legitimate justification for that, but Eric knew the game that was being played. He held the officer's gaze and replied directly, "Home." Larson narrowed his eyes and tilted his head slightly, as if trying to decipher something invisible. "And what do you do for work, Mr. Porter?" Another unnecessary question, another test to gauge his reactions. Officer Larson leaned slightly into the car again, evaluating Eric with a cold and calculating look. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over?" His voice was controlled, but carried an undertone of distrust. Eric, staying calm, replied without hesitation, "I imagine it has something to do with the traffic light." Larson crossed his arms and let out a slight sigh, as if he were already tired of this interaction before it even began. "That's right. You didn't come to a complete stop at the red light before turning right. May I see your driver's license and vehicle registration?" The formality of the approach should have been routine, but something in Larson's tone made it seem that this request was just a pretext for something bigger. Eric knew this dynamic well. He had seen and heard such stories countless times within the department. Without questioning, he took out his wallet and produced the documents, handing them over to the officer with a controlled movement. Larsson quickly took them and stepped back a few paces, still scrutinizing Erik with keen eyes. The pause lasted a few seconds longer than necessary, as if the officer were deliberately prolonging the tension. While Larsson checked the documents in the system, Erik watched through the side mirror as other cars passed by without being stopped. He wondered how many drivers had done the same at that light and continued without any problem. His thought was interrupted when Larsson returned, now with an even sterner expression. "Mr. Porter," he began, emphasizing the name as if savoring each syllable. "The car is registered in your name. No record of recent violations." He paused, as if expecting some specific reaction. Erik simply nodded without changing his expression. This seemed to unsettle Larsson, who rested his hand on the car window and leaned closer. "Where were you headed?" The question was not part of the standard protocol for such a simple traffic violation. There was no legitimate justification for that, but Erik knew the game being played. He held the officer's gaze and replied directly, "Home." Larsson narrowed his eyes and tilted his head slightly, as if trying to decipher something invisible. "And what do you do for work, Mr. Porter?" Yet another unnecessary question. Another test to measure reactions. Erik maintained his calm, but clearly perceived the change in the tone of the conversation. The question about his profession was not procedural. It was an invitation to a power play that Larsson was determined to win. "Public safety," he replied in a neutral manner without providing details. Larsson raised an eyebrow, clearly dissatisfied with the vague answer. "Public safety? And in what specific area?" The insistence already exceeded any reasonable justification for a simple traffic stop. Erik held the officer's gaze for a moment before answering, "Administration." It was technically true. As the head of the Internal Affairs Division, he dealt with the administrative and investigative intricacies of the police, but that particular choice of words served a purpose. Larsson wanted to establish dominance over him, to test his patience and search for any flaw to exercise further control, but Erik would not give him that pleasure. The silence that followed was laden with tension. The officer averted his gaze for a moment, as if trying to assess his options. The next moment revealed Larsson's strategy. He tapped his fingers on the car window and assumed a more imposing posture. "You know, Mr. Porter, I've seen many stops like this. Drivers trying to appear too calm, answering in a controlled manner. That usually means they are hiding something." The insinuation was clear. He wanted to provoke Erik, to make him react, to give any sign of impatience that might justify an escalation. But Erik did not fall into the trap. He took a deep breath and responded in the same serene tone as before. "Or maybe it just means that I am a citizen following the law and cooperating with the stop." Larsson's face tensed slightly, as if he had not expected that direct answer. For a moment, the officer seemed torn between two options: to continue pushing the situation towards a confrontation, or to step back and end the encounter. In the end, his ego made the choice for him. He clicked his tongue against the roof of his mouth and crossed his arms. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Porter." The order was given with unquestionable authority, but Erik knew there was no real justification for it. Even so, he did not hesitate. With a calculated movement, he opened the door and got out, keeping his hands visible. Standing before Larsson, the difference between the two became even more evident. Larsson was robust, broad-shouldered, with a tense posture, trying to compensate for his lack of control with physical presence. Erik, on the other hand, did not need to resort to displays of strength. His calm gaze and steady posture were more than enough to balance the scales. Erik exited the car without hesitation, his movements controlled and his hands visible. He had dealt with stops like this before, always as an observer, analyzing records, videos, and reports from other officers. Now he was on the other side, and the feeling of being targeted by someone looking for reasons to escalate the situation was as unsettling as it was revealing. Larson stepped back, but his rigid posture showed he was not willing to end it so soon. "Place your hands on the hood," he ordered, his voice laden with exaggerated authority. Eric held his gaze for a brief moment, assessing the situation. He knew there was no legitimate reason for that request. Under normal circumstances, a driver would only be searched if there was reasonable suspicion of a crime, and a simple traffic violation did not fit that criterion. But Eric also knew that any resistance, however minor, could be used against him. So, without altering his expression, he turned and placed the palms of his hands on the hot hood of the car. Larson slowly approached, his eyes scanning Eric from head to toe. "Anything in your vehicle I should know about? Weapons, drugs, anything illicit?" The question was almost comical. The officer knew there was no valid suspicion, yet he wanted to provoke. He wanted to see just how long Eric would maintain that irritating calm. Without turning around, Eric answered in an unshakable tone. "None of those things." Larson let out a short laugh as if he didn't believe it. "You know, most people tend to be a bit more cooperative when they're pulled over by the police." What he meant was that most people would become frightened, hesitant, trying to avoid trouble. But Eric was not like most people. He knew this was a power game, and the only way to win was not to play. "I am cooperating," he replied, simple and direct. Larson pressed his lips together, clearly dissatisfied. The ensuing silence was thick with tension, as if the officer were trying to decide his next move. Then, in a quick and unnecessary gesture, he lightly shoved Eric's back, as if to reaffirm his authority. It wasn't a strong shove, nothing that could be considered assault, but it was a test, a challenge. Larson's light push was not enough to physically unbalance Eric, but the intention behind the gesture was evident. The officer wanted to elicit a reaction, a spark of indignation that would justify an even more aggressive step. But Eric did not move. He did not tense his shoulders, did not turn his head, did nothing that could be interpreted as resistance. He simply took a deep breath and maintained his firm posture, forcing Larson to face a dilemma: continue provoking and risk exposing himself, or back down and admit that his intimidation game wasn't working. The silence dragged on. Eric could feel the officer's frustration growing with every second without a reaction. He knew Larson expected him to make a mistake, any mistake. But Eric had spent too long analyzing situations like this to fall into the trap. Then Larson decided to change tactics. He took a few steps back and crossed his arms, adopting an overly casual tone. "So, Mr. Porter, you told me you work in public safety, right?" His voice dripped with irony, as if dealing with a criminal trying to pass as respectable. "Does that mean you've had some run-ins with the police before?" The question was a test. Larson wanted to see if Eric would hesitate, show any nervousness, or change his demeanor. But Eric gave a slight smile, though the officer couldn't see it. He already knew where this was headed. "Some, yes," he replied calmly, keeping his hands on the hood. Larson made a sound of disdain and shook his head. "It's funny. You carry yourself as if you know how this works, as if you're above a simple stop." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "But I deal with guys like you all the time, always thinking they can dictate the rules." Eric finally turned his face slightly to confront Larson. His gaze was firm, but without defiance. Just an unyielding calm that, ironically, was beginning to seem more threatening than any overt resistance. "I don't think anything, officer. I'm just following procedure," he said, in a tone as controlled as a teacher correcting a student. Larson clenched his jaw, his fingers tapping on the holster of his gun, not because he intended to use it, but because its presence gave him a sense of control. "Well, then you know I can take you down to the station right now if I want to," he said, trying to regain the upper hand. But Eric did not flinch. He didn't ask why or show concern. He merely raised his eyebrows slightly, as if evaluating the statement. "Really?" he asked, his tone unchanged. Larsson narrowed his eyes, noticing that for the first time he felt himself being analyzed rather than analyzing. Discomfort began to show on the officer's face. Eric's calm, once merely irritating, now carried an entirely different weight. Something wasn't right. Larsson cleared his throat and stepped back. "What's wrong? Found it amusing?" he asked, trying to mask his own insecurity with aggression. Eric then took a deep breath and straightened up, stepping away from the car and turning completely to face the officer. His gaze carried no provocation or arrogance, but there was something there that made Larsson involuntarily recoil. "Actually, I find it curious," Eric began, adjusting his shirt sleeves slightly, "because so far I haven't seen you follow any protocol correctly." Larsson opened his mouth to respond, but Eric continued without giving him time. "You asked unjustified questions, got me out of the car without need, searched me without cause, and tried to provoke me into reacting." He took a small step forward, and Larsson felt something he had never felt before during a stop, the sensation of being cornered. Larsson's chest heaved faster than before, a silent testament that his self-confidence was unraveling before Eric's meticulous coldness. For the first time, the officer seemed to realize that he had made a mistake. Not a small mistake, but one with consequences. He tried to regain his composure, stiffening his shoulders and pointing a finger at Eric. "Listen here, you're not going to tell me how to do my job." His voice was louder now, not because he wanted to be heard, but because he wanted to drown out the doubt beginning to overwhelm him. Eric, however, didn't need to raise his voice. He merely tilted his head slightly, as if studying Larsson. "Are you sure about that?" he asked in an almost inquisitive tone. "Because from what I see, your job should involve protecting and serving. But what I'm seeing here is abuse of authority and covert prejudice." Larsson's face went rigid. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He opened his mouth, but no words came out immediately. The ensuing silence was more deafening than any argument. Then Eric reached into the inner pocket of his jacket in a slow, deliberate movement and pulled out a golden badge. He held it up between them, letting the sunset's light reflect off its surface before speaking. "Eric Porter, Chief of the Internal Affairs Division of the Sacramento Police Department." The words were spoken with absolute clarity, as if slicing through the heavy air between them. The effect was immediate. Larsson froze, his eyes widening in shock, and he took a half step back as if needing space to process what he had just heard. His breathing faltered, and Eric realized that, in that moment, the truth had finally sunk in. The ensuing silence was almost awkward. Larsson blinked several times, as if trying to absorb what he had just heard, but his expression of incredulity soon gave way to a pale discomfort. The weight of reality descended upon him in seconds. Everything he had done, every look of suspicion, every unnecessary question, every attempt at intimidation, was now not just an abuse of authority, but a mistake made in front of the worst possible person. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice now far removed from the firmness with which the encounter had begun. He tried to compose himself, straightening his posture and adjusting his uniform belt, but there was no longer any room to maintain the facade. "If I had known who you were, Would you have acted differently?" Eric interrupted, his voice remaining calm but cutting. Larsson was speechless. He had no answer for that question, or perhaps he did, but he knew that anything he said would only worsen the situation. Eric stepped forward, tucking his badge back into his pocket. "So, does that mean your approach depends on who the person is?" He tilted his head slightly. "If it was someone with less knowledge of their own rights, perhaps you would have continued with this. Perhaps you would have forced the situation even further. Is that it?" Larsson's face turned red, whether from shame or anger, but he couldn't deny it. He knew what he had done. The problem was that now he also knew that someone had seen, someone who could do something about it. Larsson licked his dry lips, averting his gaze for a moment as if searching for an escape from that situation. But there was none. He knew that any attempt to justify his actions would sound pathetic in the face of unvarnished truth. The uniform that had once granted him authority now weighed on him like a burden. "Look, I was just doing my job," he said, his voice a bit lower, as if trying to convince himself of his own words. Eric crossed his arms, watching him intently. "Doing your job," he repeated, as if pondering the phrase. "Funny, because what I saw here wasn't policing. It was abuse. It was intimidation." He paused, letting the words settle. "And I've seen that happen too many times to ignore." Larson closed his eyes briefly, pressing his nose bridge as if he felt an impending headache. He knew there was nothing he could say to get out of that situation. Eric continued, unhurried but firm. "You know what's worse? This isn't just about you. You're not the first officer to act like this. And if nothing changes, you won't be the last." The silence between them grew heavy. Larson remained motionless, feeling increasingly smaller before Eric's serene yet unyielding presence. "If you had stopped anyone else today without a badge, without knowledge, what would have happened?" Eric asked, letting the question hang in the air. Larson did not reply, and the truth was, he didn't need to. Both of them knew exactly how it would end. The feeling of powerlessness overwhelmed Larson, but what bothered him more was not the humiliation of being unmasked, but the evidence that what he had done was not an isolated mistake. Eric was right. The stop wasn't an accident, nor was it a momentary lapse in judgment. It was part of a culture that still permeated the streets and corners of the department. And for the first time, Larson was confronted with the impact of his actions. He looked at Eric, his eyes filled with something between anger and shame, but he could no longer deny it. The sight of Eric's unruffled calm in the face of his thoughtless behavior was more revealing than any defense. I don't know what you expect me to do now," he said, his voice lower than before. Eric looked at him unhurried. "Nothing you do now will change what happened," he replied in a softer tone, almost as if explaining to someone who should already know the lesson. "But what you do from now on, that can make a difference." Eric's last sentence echoed in the air, leaving Larson in a state of reflection. He wanted to say something, to justify his behavior, but he knew that words no longer held any power. Eric stepped back, already aware that his mission at that moment was accomplished. It wasn't about humiliating Larson. It wasn't about winning or losing that encounter. What was at stake was far more significant. The change that would begin within, not just in him, but in the system that allowed this kind of behavior to be tolerated. "Do you have anything else to say?" Eric asked calmly. Larson did not answer. Eric simply gave him one last look, a look that was not of condemnation, but of a call to action. He had shown what needed to be seen, and now the power was in Larson's hands. He could choose to change or to continue. But Eric already knew that change would begin right there, at that moment. Eric slowly walked away, his calm and steady steps echoing on the silent street as the sun completely disappeared, leaving only a trace of golden light on the horizon. Larson stood still, motionless, head bowed, still processing everything that had just happened. He knew that that afternoon's stop would never be just another one among many. What seemed like a simple traffic violation had transformed into a mirror, reflecting not only his actions, but a flawed system in urgent need of revision. Eric didn't need to do anything more. His presence and his words had already planted the seed for something greater, and while the officer looked at the asphalt, he felt, for the first time, that the responsibility wasn't in punishing others, but in correcting himself and rebuilding the trust he had broken. The day that had begun as another dull routine was now a turning point for both of them.